Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Dreadful Discourse, the new title to the podcast where we discuss all things Gothic in media. I'm your host, Nick Vanderwaard.
And I'm Lindsay.
And together we'll be discussing two popular topics that have come up before in our episodes, the Archaic Mother and the Phallic Woman. Lindsay, do you want to explain what those are?
Sure. So the Archaic Mother is a sort of mother goddess figure that appears in some Gothic media, but it's not necessarily a nurturing figure. Her ancientness and immenseness is usually a rather abject quality. She may be an authoritative figure or the mother of legions, one that spawns many horrors, but her might is a central feature. As for the Phallic Woman, that's usually a female character that doesn't necessarily have a phallus. It's rather a female character that embodies masculine qualities, traditionally masculine qualities, usually in the form of a warlike or a destroyer, and this can be embodied by either the protagonist or antagonist.
Moving forward through the podcast, we will be discussing a number of texts, and rather than list them all in the intro, we will be providing an exact list in the description below. So if there's anything that we talk about, there will be descriptions and timestamps in the description of the video below, so you don't necessarily have to sit through the entire video if you don't want to. And we'll also be discussing some biological components. That's Lindsay's field. And we may have an article or two about that when we talk about Archaic Mothers. We also talk about how insects reproduce, as it's sort of relevant to that. So yeah, if you're interested in what we talk about and you want more information, we'll be sure to provide all of that as well.
But feel free to ask questions in the comments.
Yes. Questions are good. Feedback is always welcome. Anything that lets us know what's good and what's bad and what's ugly definitely makes a difference.
And the episode is starting now. So in reviewing some of our old episodes, I noticed that we make frequent mention of the Archaic Mother and the Phallic Woman as themes in Gothic media, but I don't think we ever really explained those concepts in detail.
I think in the past episodes we've kind of outlined them individually. Like if an example were to come up, say, in our abject episode, we talked about Abigail, and we may have mentioned Phallic Woman or Archaic Mother in regards to that. But we definitely haven't had an episode dedicated to either the Phallic Woman or the Archaic Mother. And they're very prevalent, enduring themes in Gothic media more generally. And more often than not, they're symbolic in ways that are just kind of floating signifiers, so they pop up on a regular basis, but it's not really explained why. You're just sort of expected to understand on a archetypal level.
I'd imagine that the Archaic Mother is, by the name, a little bit easier to intuit what that's about.
I don't know. I think Phallic Woman is kind of straightforward too.
Oh, I mean, I don't think most people. I think most people unfamiliar with these concepts would take it literally.
Well, depending on the depiction, it is kind of literal. But you're right. There is a literal way of depicting it, and there is a more thematic way of going about it. Because one instance of the Phallic Mother is the xenomorph, which is literally a penis-headed monster, like a monster with female components and male components. but the phallus is like front and center. It's impossible to ignore because the head is generally something that we focus on when relating to things, especially anthropomorphic things. And the thematic rendition of the phallic woman is something like Lady Macbeth. In the play Macbeth, she implores the spirits to unsex her, take her mother's milk for gall, and fill her from toe to top full of direst cruelty, to essentially make her like a man, to make her phallic, to make her like her husband. But she, for all intents and purposes, on the outside has a female veneer. She looks harmless, but she's actually quite treacherous and dangerous.
So in this application of the phallic descriptor, it's more of a woman taking on traditionally masculine roles, taking on what's usually considered I guess, more aggressive or violent sort of role in the story.
Yeah, traditionally women would have been denied certain opportunities, especially in Gothic tales. They wouldn't have allowed to have an active role, or if they did have an active role, it would have been that of a detective who could only sort of perceive things through a limited female sphere. A lot of Radcliffean sort of stories from the late 1700s would have had women who were trapped in a dark space holding a lantern or a candelabra, and they're moving through it slowly, trying to see what they're dealing with, whereas the male characters would grab a sword and they would go and find out what the matter was. Sometimes it's pirates, sometimes it's an actual demon or monster, it just depends. But the ability to just go and get to the bottom of things in a very martial, straightforward manner would be denied to female characters.
I would surmise that the phallic woman concept is rarely applied to the protagonist in Gothic tales, so much as it is to antagonistic forces.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because from a narrative standpoint, it's ostensibly true, and yet there's a liminal component to these antagonistic forces where they double an aspect that's within or on the surface of these female heroes. Generally speaking, a woman is considered to be impure or dark if she exhibits qualities of strength. She's considered to be
threatening,
not female, not feminine, not soft. Women in these stories are generally rescued, and if they're not rescued, if they're rescuing themselves, they're not seen as women, they're seen as like a man. So there's two outcomes there, basically. One is they're not a woman because they're a monster, which is sort of the Amazon approach to things. Or two, they are not a woman, they're like a man. But in either case, from a traditional viewpoint, they're considered undesirable. They're considered not what they're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And these qualities are often, in a traditional sort of way, not supplied to the hero. They are supplied to, as you put it, antagonistic forces, because through a traditional lens, you can't give them to a female character without altering her. Or if you do give them to her, they have to be meted out conservatively, because if you give them too much, then you're going to turn them into something that society is not expecting them to be. So, one quick example. I just watched Cobra Kai Season 3. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen that. But there's the character Sam, and there's the character Tori. Sam is the good girl next door, and Tori is the bad girl. Tori is tall, she's very athletic and strong and tough, and when she fights with spikes. She fights dirty. You know, she's basically a street fighter. And her attitude is sort of that of being on the wrong side of the tracks. And she has kind of a hard, rough and tumble life whereas Sam comes from a privileged family. She's middle class, she's white, and she is constantly afraid of Tori, who her own parents are ridiculing for being not girly, not proper. And Sam is taught that Power Rangers kind of approach to fighting, which is never use your powers for offense, don't fight dirty, and Sam is afraid of what Tori represents because Tori is everything that Sam isn't supposed to be. She takes what she wants, she fights dirty, and she's capable of committing violence in situations where Sam kind of falls apart. She's not able to defend her friends, and that in and of itself is kind of terrifying, and Tori is sort of the personification of those fears.
So a lot of abjection applied to characters that would normally be described as being the phallic woman, but at the same time, there's just a hint of admiration, I would say, maybe to some audiences.
Sure. I actually like Tori a lot more than I like Sam because Sam feels kind of antiquated. She is the idealized kind of heroine from a traditional standpoint, whereas Tori is a transgressor. She's a threat to that, but she's also just a lot more fun to watch.
And I mean, I haven't watched the show, but is Sam at all like kind of a little bit envious of that sort of?
There are instances. She's kind of the Mary Sue character, basically, where she doesn't have any sort of noticeable flaws, but her greatest flaw is the fact that she has no flaws, and that she's sort of unable to understand through the process of abjection what Tori even signifies, because when Tori and she confront, she just kind of falls apart, and that's her greatest weakness. She's unable through introspection to identify what Tori even means to her as sort of a counter force. In terms of the phallic woman being enviable, being desirable, oftentimes, even though there is an antagonistic quality to these types of characters, they are desirable. Sam, as far as I'm concerned, as a male audience member, I find Sam to be, frankly, rather milquetoast, rather boring. And Tori, they make sympathetic in narrative ways, just what she has to go through. She doesn't have everything given to her, but just purely through the aesthetic of the phallic woman. She's tall, she dresses in black, she's a little bit sexier and more dangerous, and she just looks tougher, like she can actually fight. And there's a lot of reasons why someone might find that desirable, but even just the base difference between the two characters, where one is about action, one is about aggression, and the other is more about being passive. And that base distinction between them is enough to divide people, to polarize them. And traditionally, that polarization and an attraction towards the side that you're not supposed to like is what Gothic stories are all about in regards to phallic women.
Well, and when you think of stories about, Amazons or Gorgons, Medusa, these are characters that you're not supposed to admire their enemies, but for the women that are restricted in their roles in society, the point of the story is, oh, you don't want to be like the Amazons. They're monsters, but we kind of do, actually.
Historically, the Amazons and monsters like Medusa were meant to be prescriptive, like you say, and they were meant to put women in their place. But as time progressed, and I suspect even during those times, women would have had the opportunity to reflect on these monsters, which would be abjections of all the things they're not supposed to be. And they might look at that and go, you know what? That sounds kind of cool. Now, historically, these types of rights would have been utterly denied to them. And the first, second, and third waves of feminism that we think of today wouldn't come about until the 20th century. In the case of, say, you've probably heard the expression, "I am woman, hear me roar."
Yeah.
So that comes from a more aggressive French type of feminism from the second wave, wherein women were expected to behave more monstrously, to be more transgressive, to be more wild in a way that would have been perceived as traditionally wild, as traditionally like the Gorgon.
Traditionally masculine.
Yeah, exactly. There's a difference between a man acting masculine and a woman acting masculine in a way that threatens men.
Right.
Because a man, if he is acting masculine, doesn't turn other men to stone. He doesn't have snakes for hair. He doesn't have, like, the female components of it. And that's what makes the phallic woman kind of interesting, is that you can give a woman phallic components, because ideas of masculinity are actually a gender concept that can be applied to either. But historically, they're applied to women with a sexual component. And that sexual component that women have, sexual reproduction, is not something that you can give back to men. You can't make men female, really. It doesn't work quite the same way. Whereas women, you can give them phallic components. You can make them stronger. You can make them more powerful. You can teach them to fight. But the moment you start introducing things like the ability to lay eggs, like the xenomorph, they become female. That's a one-way street, basically. And that adds an element of the unknown to these types of characters. Now, from a gendered standpoint, you can have, instead of phallic woman, you could have vaginal man. But just from all the traditional kind of baggage in terms of this treatment being focused on sexual reproduction, there's just no history for it. Whereas with phallic women, historically, women have been treated as these kind of dumping grounds for all the things that they're not supposed to be.
We talked about that a lot in the abjection episode, especially as it relates to reproduction, birth. There's a lot of shame and uncleanliness has been foisted on women just due to their role both in reproduction and kind of given a second-class citizen standing in society.
Yeah, there's a sheltered component to men that they don't often have to face about themselves, an emasculating quality that when exposed to the things that women experience on a daily basis, like a newborn baby, it happens every day, where women are exposed to childbirth as a daily process where life and death become intertwined, because oftentimes a child is born, a mother can potentially die. This is all localized, architecturally speaking, in the vagina. So a lot of, you're in a parthenogenic space in a Gothic story if it's womb-like. What people nowadays would refer to as a Giger-esque appearance, then they're going to take on the appearance of the womb. They'll have soft, dark, fleshy walls. It's all kind of psychological and early 20th century kind of bent.
Which we'll get into a bit more with the Archaic Mother.
Right, and but just the notion of abjection being associated with things that are disgusting and gross, that gives them kind of a second-class citizen component, like they're animals, like they're used to breed. Whereas as men are kind of elevated above that, but when they confront the phallic woman, let's say, or they confront the wild, dangerous kind of woman, sometimes those elements of sexual reproduction are something that they have to experience for the first time, which for them, the only way they can relate to is from being born, which is a traumatic event that they can't necessarily remember, but plenty of guys seem to get grossed out by the idea of blood coming out of the vagina, which for them is quite horrible, but for women is literally a monthly occurrence that they have no choice about whatsoever. And that's another part of the phallic woman, is when they're being aggressive, when they're entering the public sphere, those icky, gross components that make them second-class citizens, that make them animal-like, are brought with them. So their masculinity, the blood on their masculine hands, is literally period blood.
Another concept that comes to mind regarding frequent themes with the phallic woman would be witches. The witch is ostensibly often like a normal woman that has seized power for herself, maybe with deals with the devil or maybe some other ancient gods, but in any case, unlike Medusa, there's not really, I don't think, a backstory with that character. It's pretty much always been a monster as far as that goes. But for the witch, not only was it an aggressive act to go after that power, but then once seized, she can wield it in a way that probably would make the male audience very uncomfortable.
Right. So taking that idea and going back to the masculine hands of the phallic woman dripping with period blood, let's take a look at Carrie, right? Because Carrie is very much a phallic character whose power, in the eyes of her own religiously fanatic mother, is seen as that of a witch. Shortly before her mother decides to attack and try and kill Carrie, she says, "Thou must not suffer a witch to live." And Carrie is an individual who doesn't necessarily have full control over her power, and oftentimes there's an untested component to phallic women in terms of their power, just because society doesn't allow them to be fighters. It doesn't allow them to be aggressive, so when they have it, they don't have quite the same experience that male characters might. Now, that's not to say that there aren't plenty of inexperienced, incompetent male characters in stories. There most certainly are, but female characters, when they have this type of power, they don't necessarily know what they're doing with it, and there's often a Promethean component to it. So in the case of Carrie, when she balloons, they dump the pig's blood on her, animal blood. She taps into her power through kind of an infantile rage, and she kills everyone at the school. And then as she's walking away from the wreckage, the antagonist of the movie, or one of the movie's antagonists, tries to run her over with her boyfriend's car, and then Carrie sort of turns around and does her mind attack on them, and then the car explodes. And they both die. And often phallic women, either they actualize at the very end of the movie in the credits roll, which is the end of the story, or the story ends with them being destroyed in some shape or form. It's pretty common. Usually because they're the villain, and villains aren't allowed to live.
Well, the example you give of Carrie, where her transformation occurs on screen, and the chaos of that power, how it expresses itself, isn't always how it would appear like it, because there's certainly plenty of powerful female antagonists that are fully in control and aware of their own power.
Sure.
And can apply it with cold precision. The
Witch, when we watched that movie, we do have a phallic woman who is in total control, but she's tempered by a patriarchal presence, in this case, Satan. But in the case of Lady Macbeth, she's literally the wife of Macbeth. So she has a secondary role, and point in fact in that story, she commits suicide after going insane for trying to be like a man. She has to manipulate Macbeth to do what she wants, because it wasn't his idea to kill Duncan. And it's she's definitely pulling the strings, but for her, it's kind of self-destructive. But there are phallic women that are more in control of their powers. Can you think of any off the top of your head?
Yeah. The ones that are monsters from before the story even starts generally already kind of have a pretty good handle on their power. They're like spoken of in whispers. They're notorious. They're possibly legendary.
They're also rarefied as monstrous and abject. Like, the more control of they are, the less they're allowed to exist in society because they represent a threat. Castlevania Season 3, the vampire queens are in total control of what they're doing, but they're also a legend from another time. Freud's essay, Medusa's Head, where the patriarchal gods that kind of make up the mythical backbone of society nowadays in the West is preceded or predated by these archaic goddesses that are sort of terrifying to men. These types of things, these legends or these boogeymen, like, they're gods. Like, and what is a god? A god is something that's powerful that can create or destroy things on a whim. It's in control of its power, usually, not always. And these vampire queens in Castlevania are a good example of that. They're in total control. They always are what they are, but they're from another place, another time. Like, they're literally outsiders or invaders. Gothic stories, of course, will stress the fact that they're not extraterrestrial. You know, they're from Earth. They're rulers. There was actually, like, female dynasties and bloodlines, but they've been, like, forgotten. Just in a Lacanian sense, there is no outside. There is no real. The point is, the more control a female character is, a monstrous phallic woman is, the more she's pushed to the fringes of society. She wouldn't be allowed to be president of the United States, at least not in a traditional society.
And you mentioned the power over life and death that a godlike phallic woman may have. That power over life and death segues pretty neatly into the Archaic Mother, because that is essentially what the power of the Archaic Mother is. It's womb-like properties, but also with the power to destroy what it has created.
Or to make demons.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes, phallic women aren't always sexually reproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on how you look at it, something like the xenomorph isn't very good at sexually reproducing. It's more parasitoid. There's this sense of, like, an abortive offshoot that's being created repeatedly by taking someone else's offspring and turning them into monsters. We're not actually making anything living. You're making, like, these imperfect undead qualities. So there's always, like, this monstrous zombie-like offspring that's being produced by something like the Alien Queen.
But she's still producing a legion.
That's true. It is a legion, and demons are babies too. And I'm sure that in her own monstrous way, she employs and uses them in a type of reproductive cycle that's more akin to insects than it is to humans. So it's still sexual reproduction. She's still a mother, but you're taking that sense of the animal other and you're imprinting it onto something more anthropomorphic. And oftentimes, though not always, that is how archaic mothers function, is they take an element, an undesirable aspect of sexual reproduction, and they imprint it onto a character who is already powerful in ways that when you look upon them, you are reminded of things that you would rather forget about.
One thing that I also wanted to speak to was you mentioned the xenomorph queen, that its reproduction is still sexual, but are there male xenomorphs that mate with the queen? Because otherwise it's parthenogenic, which in and of itself is kind of goes straight into the phallic woman, because that is a woman that can reproduce without the need of men, and that concept alone can be threatening, that men aren't even needed in that situation.
That's true, they're not, and I guess we should just talk about the alien life cycle, and it's, depending on which movie you're watching,
right,
different. And there is no hard and fast rule as far as that goes, though there are different canonical texts that tend to inform future interpretations of the same recursive legend. And in the first Alien, there was something called an ovomorph. I don't know if it was specifically called that at the time, or if that was like retconned jargon that was inserted into the story after the fact. But basically, the life cycle was there are these eggs in the ship. Cain finds an egg. Cain is impregnated. He gives birth to the monster, which abducts other members of the crew. It takes them to the dark bowels of the ship where it turns them into eggs. And that is parthenogenic, that the female components of the creature are such that sexual reproduction doesn't require a man because all it needs is a host. And as far as I understand it, it doesn't even need a human host. It just needs something organic of comparable size to the facehugger in any case. Though obviously the facehuggers, the way that they impregnate, they would need some type of organic creature with some type of opening like a mouth or a cavity that it could insert an egg into, and then from that point it has access to its genetic material.
And that example alone is also a good example of the Phallic Woman, because it is piercing the person sort of in a natural opening already, so it's rape-like. But to implant an egg, and eggs are usually associated with the female, like it.
Yeah.
That's the gamete that's typically associated with female sex.
Yeah, instead of it being male rape, because this is not sperm, it's injecting an egg, which fertilizes as soon as it is within the host, or it's already fertilized.
Right.
And so effectively, the sexual reproductive components have already been achieved, and it's only using the human as a host while stealing their gametes, their genetic material to complete. So the parasitoid components, like, basically it's like, okay, it has the sexual components taken care of, it just needs the raw genetic material. It's a thief and an imposter. And it's a perversion of sexual reproduction because, like you said, it's parthenogenic.
Well, yeah, and I mean, parthenogenesis occurs naturally in many species, like insects, which, if it is the case that the queen reproduces asexually, then the comparison to an insect is apt. But for sexual reproduction to occur, you need, like, at least two different gametes to meet. Whereas there are examples of insects that they don't need that other gamete. A queen bee, when she lays eggs, she'll use sperm to fertilize female workers, but a drone is just straight up her own genetic material. So she's creating males without the use of males.
And that plays off the idea of a female god that basically makes men from out of clay, or just out of her own stuff. And that in and of itself is not totally fictitious because it comes from nature, it comes from naturally occurring things. It's just from a female point of view that ultimately is closed off to men, because men do not have eggs. Men are actually, in terms of sexual reproduction, largely closed off from the cycle. The only thing that we're really good for as far as that goes is providing sperm. A woman, or a female creature, can, naturally speaking, reproduce without men, oftentimes with insects, which, when you kind of bond them to an anthropomorphic creature, lends a lot of abject components, because insects are generally associated with decay. They're seen as brutal, gross.
And you just generally see parthenogenetic reproduction more often in invertebrates, which are very different from humans in terms of their anatomy. Whereas there are some vertebrates that can reproduce asexually. Some reptiles come to mind. But for the most part, it's way more common in in the invertebrates. It's hard to get too much further from humans in the animal kingdom in terms of anatomy without going microscopic anyway.
Right. You mentioned invertebrates, so something that leaps to mind is cephalopods. So octopuses and squids. Those are both.
Yep.
Okay.
And cuttlefish, nautilus.
Generally, cuttlefish I think are seen as kind of cute, but yeah, that Lovecraftian sort of Parthenon of different animals from the deep, where the ocean is a site of primordial, unknown fear, primordial xenophobia, and in this case, it's also kind of like zoophobia, fear of the animal, fear of the unknown. And the Archaic Mother is responsible for taking those fears and bringing them into a domestic sphere by merging them with something that we can partially recognize, which is woman. The Archaic Mother brain, is, depending on the version, of course, in the original version, she's just a brain in a jar. But as you move forward to Super Metroid, she is actually anthropomorphized. She has a human-like body. She has boobs. She also has a crown of thorns. And that's another component of the Archaic Mother, is that regal component. She is a god. She is a queen. She is powerful. Numinous. The alien queen from Aliens also has a crown, but it is that of like an African voodoo mask on a T-Rex.
Yeah, that's a pretty apt description.
Yeah, and so these zoophobic, xenophobic, and these fear of woman too, female phobic components in terms of fear of female gods, fear of the parthenogenic mother goddess that has control over life and death. They're all brought to the fore with these types of archaic mothers.
And you certainly don't even have to anthropomorphize an archaic mother in some cases, just a sort of disembodied womb-like being. What comes to mind is like the ending of, is it the second Mother game?
Earthbound. It's just called Earthbound.
The second one is just Earthbound. Oh,
yep,
okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, and that sense of Earthbound, take the idea of an extraterrestrial being bound for Earth. In that story, I believe that Gygas, which is the threat you're referring to, is actually extraterrestrial. But more often than not, when these confrontations are occurring, it forces you to relate to things in a way that causes you to reflect on the abject components of your own biology, of your own status as human. So when the heroes in Earthbound confront Gygas, they're in this giant womb, and there's this vaginal opening in the wall, and there's a mirror, and the mirror shows a copy of the hero who has to look upon himself. And that is an important role of the Archaic Mother. More than the Phallic Woman, but the Archaic Mother is that she can literally, just by existing, provide a double for the character to confront, which shines a light on some of the more unpleasant aspects of themselves. Samus Aran is a phallic woman. She's powerful, and she takes things by force through rapine. And when she confronts Mother Brain, she finds the actual lord of Zebes. She realizes that they're not that different from each other. And whether or not she actually acknowledges that in the story is one thing, because these stories are vicarious. Part of the horror is the fact that, oh my god, Samus is a lot like Mother Brain. And Samus actually takes Mother Brain's own weapon and uses it against her, the Rainbow Beam or the Hyper Beam. It has a different name depending on who's using it, but she literally takes her own power and kills her with it. And she becomes the queen herself, the same way that Macbeth did when he becomes King of Scotland. It's a sense of a return to the way that things are done when the boys are in charge. Well, it turns out that women operate that way too. you could probably tell me a thing or two about how wasps reproduce and how hardcore it gets when there's a changing of the guard.
Yes. In the case of many wasp species, such as like paper wasps, they go through a annual cycle wherein when they start producing males, up to that point it's an all-female colony. They're not all necessarily from the same female the way a bee colony is. Some of the members of a wasp colony might have come from another colony that got destroyed, but there's definitely a pecking order. So there's like effectively a queen, and that's usually the biggest, baddest, most dangerous of the wasps, and they bully their way into that position. But when they start producing males, when it comes time to start the cycle anew, it's kind of a free-for-all at that point. All the females that can will try to produce their own offspring if they can get away with it, if the wasp in charge will allow it or won't notice. But
not to use the wrong expression, but it's every man for himself. But in this case, it's every woman for herself, but in a masculine, what would be seen as a masculine or a manly kind of way. Except for insects, it's not, there's no sense of, it's not impostorous. It's actually, that's how it works. And generally speaking, in human society, that's not how it works, but there are methodological components that suggest that it could very well be a thing. Even if it's just something that you're afraid of. See, being afraid of something doesn't mean that it actually has to be real. Something like Mother Brain is, for all intents and purposes, a monster. You've told me in the past how you find the xenomorph to be somewhat ridiculous, biologically speaking, but as a monster, it's totally effective.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of something like Mother Brain, all that matters in terms of its efficacy is not that it's actually possible physically, but that it has components that suggest elements of reality in a way that you can be afraid of. Mm-hmm. Because our imagination, more often than not, is chimeric. It takes elements of various things and it kind of throws them together to create this sort of amorphous-like creature.
Right, and even the term archaic suggests a very primordial, something that's been there far beyond our life experience, and so we wouldn't even know what its life cycle is potentially. But something like a Gaia, like Mother Earth sort of like figure can be an example of an archaic mother, which in that case it's usually a positive, but it's still also fearsome given it's just
Take Chernobog in Night on Bald Mountain, where he's doing the dance with his little minions, mm-hmm. and he has these little fire women on mm-hmm. the palm of his hand, and then he kind of changes the color of the fire, and they turn into these horned, ugly little demons, and then he stamps them out of existence.
Mm.
Now, take the same idea, and you have, let's say, a visually welcome archaic mother, a Gaia, mother goddess, big boobs, big, full-bodied, you know, mm-hmm. just nubile, fertile.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of men, or a lot of people who, depending on who you are sexually into that type of thing, might look at it and be like, wow, that's really welcoming, that's really inviting. Now take a character like that and have her do what Chernobog did. And it would make perfect sense because she's a mother goddess. Now, generally speaking, female goddesses, their reproduction is sexualized. Zeus pulled Metis out of his forehead. Like, his parthenogenesis is really wacky because men don't have wombs, but women do. They're just born with them. So, mother goddesses, archaic mothers, generally do give birth, or they lay eggs in the case of the xenomorph queen. It's very rare that you have a female type of reproduction with an archaic mother that doesn't have something to do with their womb or their vagina. Like, they're not just going to break off their arm and turn it into a demon. Lilith, the queen of demons, for instance, gives birth to demons in the way that you might expect, vaginally.
Right, and I mean, Zeus certainly is known to go around reproducing with other deities and humans. It's kind of optional, it seems like, with male deities to go either way with that, either reproducing asexually in a very abstract kind of way, in a way that people don't normally do, again, like you said, just pulling off a piece of themselves. But yeah, I really, it's hard for me to think of an example.
Well, you can't give Zeus a womb,
Right.
because the moment you do, he's an archaic mother.
Yeah.
The womb is female.
Right.
And this also goes into the idea of the other as female. Woman is other, Simone de Beauvoir.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of the other as female goes back further. Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, thinkers like that would generally treat the other as female because it's unknown. And that unknown, that dark, nebulous component of this awesome nebulous force, generally speaking, is the unknown is treated as female because it gives birth, for lack of a better term, to our fears. And yet, when we're forced to confront them in reality, when they do anthropomorphize, when they do personify, oftentimes they will have female components, but also with a male type of quality as well that's usually represented through, like, kingly regalia, like a crown. The Radiance in Hollow Knight has a crown. Mother Brain has a crown.
The Alien Queen.
The Alien Queen has a crown. And there are other examples as well, but what's interesting, they can't take their crowns off.
Right.
It's literally a part of their body. Whereas male characters, kings, you can kill them and their crown will fall from their head, which suggests that male power is more precarious, because what is the ultimate power? The power over life and death. And who has that? Women. From a biological standpoint, women have wombs. They decide who to mate with, and it's kind of a left-handed compliment, because oftentimes that power is controlled through the state. It's controlled by men. At least in human societies, it is. But obviously, when you seek to empower a female character, you're infusing her with elements of other types of animals, sometimes like insects or octopuses, whatever. But the myth of unregulated female power brings home some really uncomfortable realities that men don't like to face. And what do you think some of the female attitudes towards the archaic mother are? How does that make you feel?
Well, I feel like the Phallic Woman is a lot more relatable. It kind of represents something that, from a female point of view, might even be desirable if you're willing to pay the social price for it. But the archaic mother just seems more alien. Fearsome in its power, noble in its origin, sort of
undesirable, perhaps, just because the price of power is having to be a mother, which not every woman wants to be.
Well, I don't think that the average woman could really aspire to be the archaic mother anyway. That implies a power that's even really beyond human attainment, it seems like.
Yeah, that's a valid point. A phallic woman represents something that you could actually be, whereas it doesn't matter how many babies you pop out. A Mormon poly wife, for instance, can have lots of children and she won't have any of the power. And that's where the myth of the power of the archaic mother comes from, is there's something beyond what's actually attainable by human women. Like, they're not liberated by their ability to give birth. And if they did give birth, whoever gave birth to Alexander the Great, nobody thinks about the mother. It's also an opportunity for not just men, but for also women to reflect on their own fears of childbirth.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that in terms of the intimidating qualities of the archaic mother, I feel like they, in some ways, apply to both sexes, because we're both born. I mean, we both enter the world the same way, and we've both been really close to oblivion. I mean, there was a point when we were nothing but a cluster of cells. Before that, we were just two cells fused. We've all experienced origins that are
primordial.
Yeah.
Yeah, the womb state.
Yeah.
And there are different schools of thought in regards to what one can even remember, if memory is even possible while one is in the womb, and if some of these things are passed along at an instinctual level. So, in other words, trying to interpret if there's anything tangible to the alien components of the Archaic Mother, apart from the mythological side of things, just simply taking things from elsewhere, but just based on our own human experience, there is a confrontation with life as a form of coming from nothing. The concept that death literally is nothing. So if you come from nothing, which is to be born, you're basically coming out of a death-like state, a state of non-existence. And when you confront the Archaic Mother, one component of her alienness is that state of non-existence that she implies to a presence of, like, womb-like death. Of course, Gothic stories tend to conflate this kind of stuff, so it's impossible to look at pregnancy quite the same way after you watch Alien, even if it's not necessarily an accurate representation of things biologically. It still draws upon the relationship between life and death that women experience as being involuntary in terms of their own sexual processes. So an Archaic Mother might be just a really gross illustration of what women have to go through when they give birth, and the whole them giving birth to monsters is just an extension of their own frustration sometimes. Some of these psychological devices are kind of medieval. The idea that can the angry spirit of the mother be passed on through her children? And I don't know if there's actually any modern basis for that, but these types of phobias are things that we can still, like, relate to anyways. And they're definitely separate from the phallic woman. Like, the phallic woman, as you said, it focuses more on empowerment, whereas the Archaic Mother is more about the alien. It's more about confronting the other mother. Was there anything else that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, from what I understand, there actually may be a biological analogy to what you're just describing, because there has been research done on how stress hormones, when the mother's system is flooded with stress hormones during pregnancy, that may have an impact on the developing fetus as well.
Would it develop in a way that manifests in an obvious manner? Like the child, if the mother is anxious, the child would be anxious as well?
It might not manifest in the same way in that kind of sense. That sounds like a very sort of the sort of classical notions of before people figured out.
Exactly.
Yeah. Where it's like, oh well, there used to be there were myths about, like, if you encounter a certain animal or something, get bitten by something while you're pregnant, then the child might take on elements of that beast.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's classical, it's kind of medieval.
Yeah.
And
I wanted to say medieval, but honestly, these misconceptions.
Oh yeah, they
go right up to the 20th century. So.
And some of them are still here, and
yeah.
That ridiculousness of these components, that medieval or that archaic component
mm-hmm.
of reproduction is also an exploration, like a historical, a museum-like sort of presentation of this is how people used to think. But to see that come alive, like a painting where the subject is certain memento memories, for instance, were meant to be medically accurate, but they're not exactly. But to see them come alive would be, one, a way of illustrating what these people thought, while also being kind of ridiculous. So the archaic component isn't just the alien or the other, but it's also just an illustration, a depiction of what these people thought medicine was, too. And it's not necessarily that dry, but it is an element. Like, because isn't it kind of horrifying? Like, if you talk to a child and you ask them, well, how do people have babies? And sometimes they might give you an innocent little response, but if you're watching something like Knocked Up and the kid says, you pull the butt off of the mother and you pull out all the blood and the poop and the baby comes out, and it's a pretty horrendous way of thinking about things, in the same way that some of these notions, while they're wacky and abstract, are also potentially just really messed up, too. And it's kind of a separate thing from just birth is messed up. Well, so are people's archaic notions of childbirth.
Yeah, it just kind of also illustrates the mystery of childbirth or reproduction prior to modern understanding of genetics and just really basically how human reproduction works. Back when it was had more of a superstitious basis, there used to be this thought that inside of sperm was a tiny human being.
Okay, yeah.
And that's before they understood that, like, sperm and egg, they meet, they, combine
right.
it, and there's not a fully formed human there, but no, they thought that, like, the sperm was a little tiny capsule that, and at that point they'd had to have seen sperm, so, like, this is a point where they could have actually observed
under a microscope?
Yeah. But, yeah, so that's kind of wild to think. But one other thing about the Archaic Mother that came to mind regarding power over life and death. Earlier, when I brought up the concept of legion, of an Archaic Mother that just spews forth, like, just hundreds of offspring, it kind of like the Alien Queen, where she's just surrounded by eggs. In video games, often there might be a mother-like source of the waves and waves of baddies that you have to fight through. It makes the offspring kind of seem disposable. So
yes, the insect kind of just
right.
Make as many as you can, and they get killed off.
And that's not how humans reproduce. So I think that's unsettling from a human audience, because to think of a child as disposable, you could make hundreds more. I mean,
it exposes a component to the universe. And this kind of plays off the idea of cosmic nihilism, like where there are qualities to the universe that our mind is closed off to, and that if we were exposed to them, we might wish that we were not. And one of them is just how insects reproduce. Studying them, looking upon them, is horrifying. And that horror stems from the comparison between how they reproduce versus how we reproduce. Because if you watch an ant get stepped on, or you watch ant babies get killed, it's kind of gross and it's kind of horrifying. But if you conflate that, or if you treat it liminally as kind of a quasi-human experience, then suddenly it's even worse, because it forces you to imagine human babies behaving like insects. And that's where a lot of the horror from The Fly comes from, is where you have human characters who are acting like insects, which sounds even worse than just insects acting like insects. Because it's the contrast is what really drives the horror home. It's not a mirror if you can't see your own reflection in it. And that's another thing that Archaic Mothers do when they bring that insect-like component, and they're marrying it with all of this other stuff, because the chimeric components have to do with all of the things that we've talked about, so they're not discrete.
Right. And we've definitely covered the abject aspects, but that makes, as far as conflating human reproduction with this sort of bizarre alien or
medieval
or just sort of invertebrate-like reproduction. But there's kind of there can be an uncanny element because there's, if we personify it, we're connecting with that, but our minds just can't really wrap around the strangeness, the alien aspect of.
There's a sense of the familiar and the unknown. But also, the unknown in Gothic stories is often an invader. And that sense of invasion is inevitable just because of the comparison taking place. When you will be inevitably drawn towards the human components, which in this case are interlaced, interwoven with the insect-like things that lead to comparisons that are ultimately horrifying no matter what you do. But also uncanny. That entire reaction is uncanny. But also, the horror is uncanny as well because it's not just gross, but it's gross because you're relating to it in this kind of half-human, half-insect kind of way. You're stuck. You oscillate. And there is no way to undo that because these things are deliberately constructed. So it's not just, you're not just exhibiting, hey, this is how people used to think once upon a time, or hey, this is what old patriarchal guys are afraid of. It's also, this is what you get to experience from an uncanny standpoint just for the sake of it.
Yeah.
And that's arguably one reason. Why do these things keep reoccurring? Well, when Rudolf Otto wrote about the numinous, he said that there were certain unique feelings that took place in the presence of power. Well, the same idea extends to the uncanny. It's its own unique kind of thing. And Gothic stories love it.
Oh yeah. What also comes to mind is It Follows, where the antagonist in that literally oscillates between male and female forms throughout the entire movie.
Yeah, a sense of the imposter, a sense of reproducing in a viral parasitoid kind of way.
Yeah.
That is, which is its own sort of idea, where just in terms, if you remove the biological components and you just look at it as a media configuration of all of these disparate ideas and things, it survives through our fears of these symbols that are arranged in a unique way.
Well, in the case of It Follows, also, like, the antagonist in that is basically a sexually transmitted curse.
Yeah.
So you could probably have a Freudian field day with that alone.
And often these stories are commentaries on sex.
Yes.
Or phobias of sex. And going back to the idea of the phallic woman and whether or not any of these ideas should even be explored to begin with, the Gothic is exploring ideas of impropriety in sexual relationships or just sexual symbols, really. Is it even allowed to express some of these things at all? And the Archaic Mother kind of embodies that more holistically, because the phallic woman can just be an Amazon who's tough and they never even talk about sexual reproduction at all. Whereas the Archaic Mother is everything in the kitchen sink. And in that case, you don't even have to talk about the womb. You don't have to actually have sexual reproduction. You can just have this Shoggoth-esque T-1000 kind of thing. The T-1000 is a good example of an Archaic Mother compared to the Xenomorph, whose parasitoid reproductive cycle is much more sexualized, whereas all the T-1000 has to do is touch you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I could get on board with the T-1000 as a form of Archaic Mother, because it doesn't really give birth to new things. It doesn't even take over the lives of others. It just basically makes a facsimile on itself, and that's not really creation so much as just mirroring.
Well, It Follows is also just mirroring. It's not creating anything new.
Oh yeah,
but there's a sense of newness in regards to what the image is. So the image as it actually exists outside of the creature versus it as a mask that you're still interacting with, that sense of creation is still...
Well, I wouldn't even consider the being in It Follows as an archaic mother either. More of a phallic woman, I suppose.
Okay, no, that's a good distinction to make. Even if we took the T-1000 and replaced its sort of ground state as a male character played by Robert Patrick, if we made the ground state female and that the T-1000 was played by a woman, you would still just consider it a phallic woman, not necessarily...
Yes. Now, if the T-1000 was able to split off blobs of itself and that could turn into, like...
New blobs?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
then,
no, that makes
yeah,
sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense, because it isn't able to produce the legion.
Right.
Okay, that's a good distinction to make, I think, because the phallic woman definitely doesn't do that. She's restricted to her own body, and anything that she has to steal. Mm-hmm. So Samus Aran can't reproduce. Basically, she has to steal all of her shit from Mother Brain and Mother Brain's castle, basically. Whereas Mother Brain, if she wanted to, she can make an army of monsters. It's interesting, actually, because Mother Brain is an archaic mother. Like, she totally is. She doesn't actually reproduce, though, in the game. She's a symbol of motherhood and a symbol of, like, mythical female control. But she doesn't make the Metroids. She doesn't make any of the animals. She was actually a security system, a biomechanical security system that was designed to regulate the ZB's mechanical interior. Basically, she regulates civilization for the Chozo, but then it goes out of control. The Chozo are eradicated by their own creation, kind of like the Shoggoth, basically. And so it's not necessarily incumbent entirely on sexual reproduction, literally, but also just symbols of sexual reproduction. And in the case of Mother Brain, it's literally just her relating to a prior generation in terms of who owns the manor. In this case, Mother Brain is the prior resident. She's the lord of the castle, dynastically speaking. And Samus Aran comes along and is like, hey, this is my castle, bitch. Because she was raised by the Chozo, whereas Mother Brain was just tinkered in their garage, thrown together. So in that case, the archaic mother can also have to do with dynastic power relations as opposed to fucky fuck time.
So motherhood in the sense of a matriarchal force as opposed to an actual reproductive role.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, that makes sense.
And you get brownie points, of course, for the Legion, but it's not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Even so, even with that added codicil thrown in there, I would say that the T-1000 and It Follows, they are subsisting. They're not reproducing. They're just kind of surviving like vampires. Vampires don't reproduce. They just suck your blood, and they jump from host to host. So the T-1000, It Follows, they're more like phallic women or something like that. Like they're in this weird gray area. They're mm-hmm. not really, and they're also not matriarchal. They're just instruments. They're like rogue creations, like Frankenstein's monster or something like that.
Yeah, I feel like there is a sort of an impulse to characterize the creature in It Follows as female, just because that's how we're introduced to it.
Right.
And some of the arguably scariest scenes are usually with it in a female form. However, though, it doesn't seem to really have any gender or sex of its own.
No, it is so alien that it can be whatever it wants to be, which is, from a male mythological standpoint, comparable to, say, Zeus, where Zeus can assume whatever form he wants. He can turn into golden mist or a swan or whatever he needs to accomplish his goal. The force in Forbidden Planet, same kind of idea, where it's literally just a planetary force, which is an extension of Dr. Morbius. He activates this powerful machine, which basically turns his will into a force that, though invisible, can make his wishes come true, but in a very destructive kind of way. in It Follows, you basically have a force that has been separated from whatever we could assume is piloting it. There's no way to know what is dictating it, if it's male or female, or if it ever was. It's just purely unknown. So you can't really give something like that female qualities, even though the tendency in the early 20th century by people like Freud or Jung would be to say, oh, well, it's female because it's unknown. Well,
yeah, right.
That's just jumping the gun.
Yeah.
And it's totally possible to have some kind of something that is what we might traditionally assign as like a phallic woman kind of thing, that really is just its own sort of alien monster, really. And obviously these things aren't wholly discrete. There is a tendency for us to just jump to, oh, that's a phallic woman, because that's what I did when we were talking about the monster from It Follows. The first thing I thought of was Archaic Mother, and then I'm like, no, it's kind of a phallic woman. I think it's just, it has qualities of these things, but it's not really female, and it's not really male. It's just sort of its own thing. And
I can understand the impulse to initially characterize it as an archaic mother, though, because the archaic part might be accurate, because its origins are unknowable. Having unknowable origins, if it spawned itself somehow, that hints at like a parthenogenic origin.
If it survives after dying at the end of the film, maybe that's how it subsists. So it's not just a parasite, but it's something that continually recreates itself almost through a process of mad science. And that, of course, is left out of the equation. Assuming that it was made or that it was born, we don't really know. And the only reason I say mad science is because it seems like something that's almost weaponized.
Yeah, but I wouldn't characterize it as something even within the realm of... There's definitely a metaphysical property to it.
I tend to hesitate towards metaphysical or supernatural, maybe. Yeah. But see how what we're doing here is, I'm like, I think it might be this. Even if, and then you're like, oh, well, I think it might be this. There is an ambiguous component to the phallic woman and the archaic mother. And sometimes when these things are made, they are often presented with the anticipation of the director that we will initially think of it as being one type of thing. Mm-hmm. Someone might be like, Sarah Connor in Terminator 2, what the fuck is it? What the fuck is going on? Well, they easily could have thrown in an extra line of dialogue. Oh, is it a weapon? Well, how does she know that? What if it's just an animal? You know what I mean? Obviously, she's going to think it's from Skynet, which makes monsters. Actually, come to think of it, do you think Skynet would be an archaic mother?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, just in the kind of Legion sense. It's not very archaic, I guess, but...
No, it's not. And can an archaic mother exist in sci-fi stories?
I feel like, yes, just because it embodies a deity-like power that we would associate with something archaic.
And technophobia comes from older superstitions, mm-hmm. which are from the past. So even if the imagery itself is, wow, so technological, so fancy, Frederick Jameson's idea of images of the future that age are ultimately dated themselves. Mm-hmm. So James Cameron's vision of the future, as shiny and chrome-like as it is, there's no Gothic dust on it, but it's still antiquated in a similar way, including how we relate to it.
Would that qualify as hauntological?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say so. In that sense, there's a sense of the pastness is the fact that you have this sci-fi image of the future that's infused with phobia. And also it's just dated, too. It's this very 1980s kind of look.
Yeah.
And there's the Gothic disco where Sarah Connor is at technological darkness, and there are the dancers and the goofy disco music, and there are these sort of traditional archetypes dancing around on the floor. it really depends on the scene that you're analyzing, of course, but just Skynet as like this evil supercomputer, that's kind of a dated concept, but the fears are still present today. You know, they're not really going anywhere. I feel like if someone were to make Terminator now, it would feel pretty dated. And how would they go about it without sort of extrapolating on the way that technology functions? I.e., can the Terminator exist in the internet age? And the attempt of studios to make Terminator films that introduce that idea have a pretty hard time doing it. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but it feels kind of shoehorned.
It just kind of feels like if Skynet, if they did Terminator today, or like a Skynet-like concept, I don't think you'd even have Terminators, really, because if it has access to the internet, it can bring down civilizations pretty much.
Yeah, it's sort of it's unnecessary. Though that component, really, you can make the same arguments about the first film.
But as far as like making humanoid, like
that's what I mean. The Terminators themselves were wholly unnecessary.
Yeah. Yeah, I really it's definitely unnecessary, because when you think about it, infiltrators aren't necessary. If they wanted to destroy humanity, they can just wait them out. Like, they will win a war of attrition.
Well, and that notion of the sort of the Bakhtinian approach to things, where the archaic exhibit coming forward to just be explored, even if it doesn't make any sense, it's still something that existed in the past. Warfare is something of the past. Fears of particular things in a past-like way is brought forward, even if it doesn't make any sense. So if someone's afraid, visions of a post-apocalyptic future, what is the cataclysm? War. But predominantly images of war that don't really seem to belong in the future.
Yeah. Come to think of it, I can think of a way to justify the form of the Terminators as being so anthropomorphic. I mean, we tend to create technology in our image. Our goals for robotics, our goals for neural net computers, we're modeling them off of ourselves. And I could see where, since Skynet is also a product of human innovation, it might just do the exact same thing.
And as far as it being an archaic mother goes, it's never totally alien. Like, the way that it's reproducing its own offspring might be a marker that it has taken from its own blueprint provided by humans.
Right.
That tendency to just create things in a very human-like way. But it's dictated also by a human-like malice to terminate the other, to kill humans, where humans are now in the crosshairs of their own invention in a very Frankensteinian kind of way.
In such a human way.
Exactly.
I mean, we are agents of extinction and destruction in a very real sense. And just the thought of us being destroyed by something we created just because it's mimicking what we do, and, a reflection of our own phobias. It's scary, but also kind of seems like poetic justice at the same time.
Yeah, and keep in mind, the Skynet is an extension of technology, where these myths come alive and are imbued with our own human forces, including sexual reproduction, phobia, whatnot. And it's not that different than a fatal portrait, where someone painted Lilith, and then Lilith came out of the painting and started killing us, not because the painter painted her with a ferocious sort of veneer, but that at a subconscious level, being unaware of what he was capable of as a painter, that he could bring something to life, that creation might take some of these things at a subconscious level that the creator isn't aware of, that sense of the creation passing along those harmful notions.
It's exactly Forbidden Planet.
Yeah, exactly. And that component of the Archaic Mother is something that you see in science fiction films after Forbidden Planet, like Skynet.
Right.
Where it seems archaic, it seems kind of bizarre, like this weird kind of like, this is a really Gothic interpretation of the future, but it's also a very popular, enduring form that is hard to go away, both the Phallic Woman and the Archaic Mother.
And while we're on this Gothic sci-fi kick in terms of like the Archaic Mother, to bring it right back to Alien, Mother in the first movie, the ship's computer system.
Yeah.
Again, not a reproductive mother, but a matriarchal
presence. And arguably the inspiration for Mother Brain.
Right.
She wakes people up. She pushes them along to their doom.
Yeah.
And there's a sense of basically programmed to self-destruct, but not being made aware of it ever, really. And then before you know it, the ship self-destructs. Why is there even a self-destruct function in the ship? It's built in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of inevitable. And you get the feeling that this has happened recursively many times before.
Yeah.
Like this isn't the first time they've tried this.
Yeah, definitely. I can't really think of any other reason to put in a self-destruct function in what's ostensibly a cargo ship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those space truckers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Even though they're in Aliens, you freely admit to detonating the engines of and thereby destroying an M-class starfreighter, a rather expensive piece of hardware. That's $42 million in adjusted dollars, minus payload, of course. And like they reduce it in Aliens to its fiscal value, but just its function is, there are some elements there that seem out of place, and yet they exist paradoxically, which I think is sort of an aim of the Gothic through devices like the Archaic Mother, or the matriarchal version, or the sexual version, the sci-fi or the fantasy, or the animal-esque, is that they are meant to highlight paradoxical elements of the human condition by causing us to like relate to things that are impossible and confusing, and at times the fruits of our own affected minds. Like technology is an extension of ourselves, so why the fuck are we constantly writing stories like Frankenstein or Terminator? Why are there so many goddamn monsters?
Yeah, especially when it's something that, you know, ostensibly we would be creating in our own image, which I guess it really is a reflective fear. It serves as a mirror, I suppose, and that's what's so terrifying about it.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning into our podcast. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. We tried some different things this time around in terms of how the podcast appears, the background image. I drew that for the podcast. I also do artwork that's based off fantasy and sci-fi type stuff, and I wanted to do something like that for this podcast in particular, very germane. But we also changed the intro and did a couple of other things. So if you liked that, feel free to let us know. And if you didn't like that, I suppose you can let us know that too. Feedback, as long as it's constructive, is always appreciated. Also, if you want to support our channel and the content that we make, there will be a Patreon link in the description of this video. If you follow that, you can provide financial support, and any money provided goes towards improving the quality of this channel and the content that we make. Once again, thank you for your time and listening in, and stay tuned for our next episode.
Bye.
Alright, yeah, that sounds good. Are you happy with that bye?
Bye.
Okay, yeah, we can.